The night America almost died. They were not soldiers, not really. They were blacksmiths, farmers, immigrants, runaway apprentices, enslaved men promised freedom, teenagers who had never fired a musket in anger. And in the winter of 1776, they were about to gamble the future of human democracy against the most powerful empire on earth. If they lost that night, the United States of America would never exist. December 25th, 1776. The Delaware River was a sheet of broken ice, floating like shattered glass under a moonless sky. The wind was merciless. Snow stung like needles against exposed skin. General George Washington stood silently near the riverbank, wrapped in his blue cloak. He was 44 years old, tall, controlled, outwardly calm. Inside, he was carrying the weight of a collapsing revolution. Just months earlier, in July 1776, the Declaration of Independence had been signed in Philadelphia. It was bold, radical, almost reckless. It declared that ordinary people could overthrow a king and govern themselves. To Britain, it was treason. To much of the world, it was madness. And by December, it seemed like a failed experiment. The British had crushed American forces in New York. Washington's army had been chased across New Jersey. Thousands had deserted. Enlistments were set to expire in days. Many soldiers had no boots. Some wrapped rags around their feet. Blood marked their marches. Morale was shattered. Congress had fled Philadelphia. If Washington did nothing, the army would dissolve on January 1st. The revolution would quietly die. So he chose to do something insane. He would cross an ice-choked river in the middle of a winter storm and attack a professional German force stationed in Trenton. At night, on Christmas, the men climbed into Durham boats, heavy wooden vessels usually used to transport iron ore. Ice crashed against the sides. Oars froze to hands. Artillery had to be dragged across floating chunks of ice. One cannon nearly tipped into the river. Men fell in. Some didn't make it out. It took hours longer than planned. The attack was supposed to begin before dawn. They were late. Washington faced a decision: turn back and survive, or push forward and risk everything. He pushed forward. At 8 a.m. on December 26, 1776, through snow and wind, the Continental Army marched into Trenton. The Hessians, German soldiers hired by Britain, were caught off guard. Within 45 minutes, it was over. Nearly 1,000 enemy troops were captured. American casualties were minimal. The victory was small in global military terms, but psychologically, it was explosive. For the first time in months, Americans believed they could win. Re-enlistments surged. Momentum shifted. History pivoted. But the war was far from over. Over the next years, the revolution would transform from a colonial rebellion into a global war involving France, Spain, the Caribbean, and naval battles across oceans. And here's what most people don't realize. The American Revolution was won not by constant victory, but by surviving defeat. Washington lost more battles than he won. New York fell. Philadelphia fell. Charleston fell. Soldiers starved at Valley Forge. The Continental Army often had no money, no shoes, and no certainty of survival. Meanwhile, Britain had the strongest navy in the world, professional regiments, and control over global trade routes. On paper, America had no chance. But revolutions are not won on paper. They are won in patience, and Britain was running out of it. In 1778, after the American victory at Saratoga, France officially entered the war on the American side. This changed everything. Now, Britain was fighting not just in America, but in the Caribbean, Europe, and India. The war became expensive, very expensive. Public support in Britain began to weaken. The empire was overstretched. And Washington knew something critical. He did not need to destroy the British Army. He only needed to outlast it. Years later, in 1781, at Yorktown, Virginia, a trapped British army under General Cornwallis found itself surrounded, not just by American forces, but by the French Navy blocking escape by sea. It was a combined international effort. And when Cornwallis surrendered, the impossible became reality. A collection of colonies had defeated an empire. In 1783, Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. But here is the part that makes this story even more astonishing. The revolution could have collapsed at least a dozen times. At Trenton, at Valley Forge, during financial bankruptcy, during political infighting, during military conspiracies against Washington. Each time, it survived by inches. And yet, the greatest test of the American experiment was still coming. Because winning independence is one thing. Building a nation from nothing? That is far harder. If the Revolution gave birth to the United States, the Civil War nearly killed it. By 1861, the country that had once united against a king was preparing to tear itself apart. Brothers would fight brothers, fathers would bury sons, entire cities would burn, and over 620,000 Americans would die, more than in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and Korea combined. This was not just a war over land, it was a war over the meaning of freedom. For decades after independence, the United States expanded westward at breathtaking speed. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the nation's size. New states entered the Union one by one. But with each new state came a question that grew more dangerous every year. Would it be free or slave? Slavery was America's original contradiction. The Declaration of Independence declared that all men are created equal, yet millions of black Americans were held in bondage. In the South, slavery powered the cotton economy, generating enormous wealth. In the North, industrialization was rising, and abolitionist movements were gaining strength. Compromises tried to hold the nation together. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Each was a temporary bandage over a deep wound. Then came violence. In Kansas, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fought openly. Newspapers called it Bleeding Kansas. In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott decision that black Americans could not be citizens and that Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories. The nation was moving towards something catastrophic. In 1860, a tall, self-educated lawyer from Illinois was elected president. Abraham Lincoln did not initially promise to end slavery everywhere, but he opposed its expansion into new territories. For Southern leaders, that was enough. They believed their economic system and their political power was under threat. One by one, Southern states voted to secede from the Union. They formed the Confederate States of America. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. At first, many Americans believed it would be short. They were wrong. The early battles were chaotic and brutal. At Bull Run, spectators from Washington came to watch what they thought would be a spectacle. Instead, they saw panic and retreat. Modern warfare had arrived. Rifled muskets made bullets deadlier and more accurate. Railroads moved troops faster. The telegraph transmitted information instantly. But military tactics had not evolved. Men still charged in open fields and tight formations. The result was slaughter. At Antietam in 1862, more than 22,000 soldiers were killed or wounded in a single day, the bloodiest day in American history. Fields turned red. Cornfields became graveyards. But Antietam gave Lincoln something critical, a strategic moment. Days later, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free. It did not immediately free all enslaved people, but it transformed the war. The conflict was no longer only about preserving the Union. It was now explicitly about ending slavery. And that changed the world. Black Americans began joining the Union Army in large numbers. Nearly 180,000 African American soldiers would serve by war's end. They fought not just for the Union, but for their own liberation. Meanwhile, the South faced increasing hardship. The Union Navy blockaded southern ports, choking off supplies. Inflation skyrocketed. Food shortages became severe. Still, the Confederacy fought fiercely. General Robert E. Lee led the Army of Northern Virginia with boldness and tactical brilliance. For a time, it seemed possible that the Confederacy might secure foreign recognition from Britain or France. Then came Gettysburg. In July 1863, over 3 days in Pennsylvania, Union and Confederate forces collided in a battle so massive it shook the continent. On the third day, Lee ordered a direct assault on the Union center, Pickett's charge. Thousands of Confederate soldiers advanced across open ground under relentless artillery fire. They were cut down in waves. The charge failed. Gettysburg marked the turning point. The Confederacy would never fully recover. At the same time, in the West, Union General Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, giving the North control of the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in two. Slowly, relentlessly, the Union tightened its grip. Then came General William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea. Sherman embraced a strategy of total war. His troops marched through Georgia, destroying railroads, factories, and supply lines. The goal was not just to defeat armies, but to break the South's ability and will to continue fighting. War became devastatingly modern. Civilian infrastructure became a target. The psychological toll was immense. The secret that changed humanity forever. At 5:29 in the morning, the desert turned into a second sun. For a brief, impossible moment, night became brighter than day. The sky ignited in white fire. Sand melted into glass. Men who had spent years chasing equations fell silent. Some cheered. Some wept. One whispered, "Now I am become death." On July 16, 1945, in the empty desert of New Mexico, humanity crossed a line it could never uncross. The world had entered the atomic age. It began not in America, but in fear. In 1938, German scientists discovered nuclear fission, the splitting of the atom. The energy released was staggering, theoretical, terrifying. In Europe, Adolf Hitler was rising. Nazi Germany had already begun expanding across the continent. Jewish scientists were fleeing persecution. Many of them landed in the United States. Among them were some of the greatest physicists alive. They understood something that politicians did not. If Nazi Germany built an atomic bomb first, the war would be over before it truly began. In 1939, a letter reached President Franklin D. Roosevelt. It warned that Germany might be developing extremely powerful bombs of a new type. The letter carried the signature of Albert Einstein. Roosevelt responded with 2 words: "This requires action." And so began the most secretive project in American history. It had no official name at first. Later, it would be called the Manhattan Project, a harmless, almost boring title hiding something unimaginable. At its peak, over 130,000 people worked on it. Most had no idea what they were building. Entire cities were constructed in secret: Oak Ridge, Tennessee; Hanford, Washington; Los Alamos, New Mexico. Workers were told they were helping end the war. They were instructed never to ask questions. Mail was censored. Phones were monitored. Security was relentless. Even Vice President Harry Truman did not know about the bomb until he became president. In Los Alamos, atop a remote mesa, the brightest scientific minds in the world gathered. Young, brilliant, competitive. They worked under the direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer, a thin, intense physicist with sharp features and restless eyes. He spoke poetry. He quoted Sanskrit texts. He carried the burden of understanding what they were about to unleash. The challenge was staggering. No one had ever built a weapon like this. 2 designs were pursued simultaneously. One used uranium, the other used plutonium. Both required mastering physics at a scale never attempted before. Factories the size of small cities were built just to enrich uranium, a process so complex it consumed massive amounts of electricity. At one point, the Manhattan Project used more power than New York City. The cost? Nearly $2 billion in 1945 dollars, over $30 billion today, and all of it hidden from the public. By 1945, the war in Europe was ending. Germany surrendered in May. But the Pacific War raged on. Japan showed no signs of unconditional surrender. American forces had fought brutal island campaigns at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Casualties were enormous. Military planners estimated that a full invasion of Japan could cost hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of lives. The atomic bomb was nearing completion, but there was still uncertainty. Would it work? No one knew. Which brings us back to the desert, the Trinity test. At 5:29:45 a.m., a device nicknamed the Gadget was detonated atop a steel tower. The blast was beyond anything previously imagined. The shockwave shattered windows 100 miles away. A mushroom cloud climbed 40,000 feet into the sky. Observers felt the heat from miles away. For a moment, the scientists were not triumphant. They were stunned. They had unlocked the energy of the universe and weaponized it. Oppenheimer later recalled a line from the Bhagavad Gita: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The bomb worked. Now the decision moved from scientists to politicians. President Truman faced one of the most consequential decisions in human history. Use the bomb or invade Japan? Demonstrate it first or deploy it without warning? Would Japan surrender after 1, after 2? On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay flew over Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., it dropped Little Boy. The explosion leveled the city. An estimated 70,000 people died instantly. Tens of thousands more would die from burns, injuries, and radiation sickness in the weeks that followed. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. World War II was over. For many Americans, the bomb was seen as the weapon that ended the war and saved lives that would have been lost in an invasion. For others, it marked the beginning of a moral crisis that has never fully resolved. The atomic bomb did not just end a war, it changed global power forever. The United States emerged as a superpower, the only nation with nuclear weapons. But that monopoly would not last. By 1949, the Soviet Union had tested its own atomic bomb. An arms race began. Hydrogen bombs followed, far more powerful than those dropped on Japan. Missiles capable of crossing continents. Submarines carrying nuclear warheads beneath the ocean. For decades, the world lived under the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. If one side launched, the other would respond. Civilization could end in hours. The Manhattan Project demonstrated something profound about America. It showed the country's ability to mobilize science, industry, and secrecy at unprecedented scale. It united government, military, and academia. It accelerated technology by decades. But it also introduced humanity to an existential threat of its own making. The atomic age brought nuclear power plants, medical isotopes, and scientific breakthroughs. It also brought the constant shadow of annihilation. Here is what makes the story astonishing. The fate of the 20th century, perhaps the fate of humanity, turned on a secret desert test conducted before sunrise. Most Americans woke up on July 16, 1945, unaware that the world had already changed. The bomb was not inevitable. It was built by people. Brilliant people, flawed people, people who argued, doubted, feared, and calculated, and once built, it could never be unbuilt. The Revolution asked whether America could be born. The Civil War asked whether it could survive. The Manhattan Project asked something darker. If given unlimited power, what would America choose to do with it? And that question still echoes today.
America was never supposed to last. In 1776, it was a rebellion against the most powerful empire on earth, a fragile experiment built on an idea so radical that monarchs across Europe dismissed it as temporary madness. In 1861, it nearly tore itself apart from within. States seceded, brothers fought brothers. The promise of equality collided violently with the reality of slavery. In 1945, it unlocked the power of the atom, a force capable of ending not just a war, but civilization itself. 3 moments, 3 crossroads, 3 times the American experiment stood on the edge of collapse, and yet it endured. What makes this story astonishing is not that America won wars. Many nations win wars. What makes it extraordinary is that America survived its own contradictions. It was born proclaiming liberty while tolerating slavery. It fought to preserve union while redefining freedom. It built the deadliest weapon in history while claiming to defend democracy. At every stage, the nation carried tension within itself. That tension never disappeared. It evolved. At Valley Forge, survival meant believing in an idea before it had proof. At Gettysburg, survival meant redefining who counted as fully human. At Trinity, survival meant accepting that humanity now possessed the power of self-destruction. Each crisis forced a choice: retreat or risk everything, division or unity, destruction or restraint. Again and again, individuals made decisions that altered history. A general who crossed a frozen river, a president who refused to let the Union dissolve, a scientist who wrestled with the morality of his own creation. None of them were perfect. None of them saw the full future, but their choices shaped it. The American story is not a straight line of triumph. It is a cycle of fracture and rebuilding, expansion and reckoning, power and responsibility. And perhaps that is why it still captures global attention. Because the United States was not built on bloodline or ancient borders. It was built on a proposition that people could govern themselves.
That proposition has been tested by war, by division, by fear, and by power. It has survived, not because it was flawless, but because it was adaptable. Today, the questions are different. Technology has replaced muskets. Cyber warfare has replaced cavalry. Political polarization echoes old divisions in new forms. Nuclear weapons still exist. The power unleashed in 1945 still hums quietly beneath global politics. The contradictions remain, but so does the idea. The revolution asked, can a nation be born from an idea? The Civil War asked, can that idea survive its own hypocrisy? The atomic age asked, can that idea handle ultimate power? The answers were never permanent. They were decisions made by people in moments of crisis. And that is what makes the story ongoing. America's greatest strength has never been perfection. It has been the ability to confront failure and attempt reinvention, to argue loudly, to fracture deeply, and yet to continue. The American experiment is not finished. It never was. It is a living argument, a fragile balance, a nation that has nearly collapsed more than once and still stands. Not because collapse was impossible, but because at critical moments enough people chose survival over surrender. And that choice, repeated across centuries, is what turned a rebellion into a superpower. The idea that began in 1776 was never guaranteed. It was improbable, it was fragile, it was flawed, and it refused to die.